My dad had been fining my house every Friday for 11 straight months, and now he was standing at the HOA annual meeting, reading every violation aloud to 60 neighbours. I sat in the back row, listening to him describe my overgrown landscaping, improper mailbox, unauthorised fence stain, and even a flower pot he claimed violated community standards. People shifted in their chairs. A few whispered. Someone laughed. Dad smiled like he had already won. He was the HOA president after all. What they didn't know was that every fine had been deliberate, every warning had been personal, and every Friday I had paid without arguing, quietly filing each notice into the same blue folder. My hands were calm beneath the table. My heart wasn't. Then Dad lifted another sheet. Violation number 47, he announced. Failure to maintain neighbourhood appearance. That was when the county clerk, sitting near the front with a thick property file on her lap, slowly raised her hand. Sir, she said, her voice cutting through the room. Before you go on, who do you think owns lot 14? Dad stopped smiling. I finally looked up. The room went completely silence. My name is Daniel Mercer, and lot 14 had been in my family longer than I had been alive. My grandfather bought the property when the neighbourhood was nothing but empty fields and unpaved roads. He built the house himself, room by room, then left it to my father when he died. Dad never talked about the house as something we shared. He talked about it as something he had earned. I learned early that correcting him only made things worse. After my mother passed away, Dad became colder. He poured himself into the HOA, where people called him responsible, organised, even indispensable. I watched him transform from my father into a man who needed everyone else to believe he was in control. I moved back into lot 14 after my grandfather's death, expecting a quiet life. Instead, Dad treated my return like an insult. He criticised my repairs, questioned my decisions, told neighbours I was careless with the property. At first I laughed it off. Then the fines started. Every Friday, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. The reasons were always small enough to sound ridiculous individually, but together they painted a picture. I was supposedly the worst homeowner on the street. I could have fought him immediately, but I remembered something Grandpa once told me. Never argue with someone who is determined to misunderstand you. Let them finish building their own evidence. So I did. I paid every fine, saved every letter, photographed every violation, and slowly realized something Dad didn't know. Lot 14 wasn't merely my home. It was the one piece of my family's history he had never actually controlled. The first Friday fine came folded neatly inside a white envelope. Dad handed it to me himself at the end of a neighbourhood cookout. Just keeping things consistent, he said, smiling without warmth. I looked at the notice. My crime was a trash bin left visible from the street. The following Friday it was my mailbox, then the fence, then 3 inches of grass along the sidewalk. Each time, Dad found a reason to mention it in front of someone. At the hardware store, he glanced at my receipt and said, "You know, some people actually maintain what they own." At church, he told an old neighbour, "Daniel means well. He just needs supervision." I learned to recognise the little pauses before his insults, the lowered voice, the sideways smile, the quick glance around to see who had heard. I never answered. That seemed to bother him more than anger would have. Soon, neighbours began treating me differently. Conversations stopped when I approached. A woman across the street suddenly became fascinated with her phone. Whenever I walked past, one evening, I found a warning taped to my front door while Dad's truck sat across the street. He didn't get out. He simply watched. I removed the paper, folded it once, and placed it inside my blue folder. Inside, there were already 32 notices. By the 10th month, there were 46, and something else had changed. I stopped seeing those fines as harassment. I started seeing them as records. Every petty accusation was dated. Every signature was preserved. Every payment had a receipt. Dad thought he was documenting my failures. He had no idea he was documenting his own. The turning point came on the 47th Friday. I found the envelope beneath my windshield wiper while I was leaving for work. This time, Dad hadn't fined me for the house. He had fined me for unauthorized occupancy of a protected structure. I read the sentence twice. Then I looked at my house. My grandfather had built it. My father had inherited it. And somehow, Dad now believed he could decide whether I was allowed to live there. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt finished. That evening, I opened the blue folder and spread every document across my dining table. 11 months of notices, 11 months of payments, 11 months of photographs. Then I pulled out the original property documents Grandpa had left me. I had never needed to use them before. But that night, I noticed something I had overlooked for years. Lot 14 wasn't governed by the neighborhood's current HOA agreement in the way Dad claimed. Grandpa had placed the property under a separate county land covenant decades earlier. The HOA could regulate certain shared areas, but it had no authority to impose fines against my privately owned lot without the required legal basis. Dad hadn't been enforcing the rules. He had been abusing the position he held. I contacted the county clerk the next morning. I didn't ask her to punish him. I simply asked one question. Could you confirm who legally owns Lot 14? There was a pause. Then she said, yes, and I think you should bring every document. You have to the annual meeting. That was when I understood. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth in a room where Dad couldn't silence it. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing without telling Dad what I had discovered. I didn't threaten him. I didn't confront him. I didn't even stop paying the fines. Instead, I organized everything. Each Friday notice went into a separate plastic sleeve, arranged by date. Behind it, I placed the photograph proving whether the alleged violation existed. Then came the payment receipt, followed by any emails or messages connected to it. I made a simple spreadsheet showing the date, accusation, amount, and the HOA rule Dad had cited. The pattern was impossible to miss. Some rules didn't apply to my property. Others had never been properly adopted. Several violations had been issued after I had already corrected the problem. I also contacted a property attorney recommended by a colleague at work. She reviewed the documents quietly. After nearly an hour, she leaned back and said, "Don't accuse him of anything at the meeting. Ask questions. Let him explain his own records." That advice became my entire strategy. I requested the HOA's governing documents, meeting minutes, enforcement policies, and financial records through the proper channels. I wanted everything in writing. Meanwhile, I contacted the county clerk again and confirmed that the original deed placed Lot 14 under a separate, recorded covenant. Most importantly, I learned that Dad's authority as HOA president didn't give him personal ownership of my property. He had simply acted as though it did. So I prepared one final folder. Inside were the deed, the covenant, the HOA documents, every fine, every receipt, and the attorney's notes. I didn't plan to embarrass my father. I planned to let the documents speak. And on the night of the annual meeting, I carried that folder into the room without saying a word. Dad continued reading. Violation number 47. His voice was steady again, but his fingers tightened around the paper. The county clerk stood slowly. "Sir, before you go on, who do you think owns Lot 14? Dad looked at her. Then at me. For the first time all night, his confidence disappeared. "I believe the HOA owns the neighborhood," he said carefully. The clerk opened the property file. "That isn't what I asked." A silence settled over the room. She turned a page. Lot 14 is privately owned by Daniel Mercer. The recorded deed has been in his name since his grandfather transferred the property. Someone behind me whispered, "Wait, what?" Dad's face hardened. "That doesn't change the violations." "No," the clerk replied, "but it changes who had authority to issue them." She placed another document on the table. "The covenant governing Lot 14 does not grant this HOA the enforcement power you have been exercising." Nobody moved. I stood and walked to the front. I placed my blue folder beside her. "I brought the records," I said. "That's all." The clerk opened it. 47 notices, 47 dates, 47 payment receipts. The room grew quieter with every page. Then one neighbor noticed something. "Some of these violations happened on the same day." The clerk nodded. Another neighbor leaned forward. "And he collected money from all of them." Dad started explaining, but nobody was looking at him anymore. They were looking at the paperwork. The HOA board voted that night to suspend his authority pending review. I watched him gather his papers with trembling hands. 11 months of control had ended in less than 20 minutes. I didn't smile. I simply picked up my folder and walked home. By Monday morning, the neighborhood felt different. Nobody gathered outside Dad's house. Nobody needed to. The HOA board had begun reviewing every fine he had issued, and neighbors who once avoided my eyes were suddenly knocking on my door. One woman brought a folder of her own. "I think he fined me for something similar," she said quietly. Then another neighbor came. Then another. I realized my experience hadn't been an isolated mistake. Dad had made people feel small because he believed the position, gave him permission to do it. Some apologized. Others didn't. I understood why. Embarrassment has a way of making people disappear before it makes them speak. Dad never came to apologize. Instead, he stopped answering my calls. For weeks, I drove past his house without turning my head. That hurt more than I expected. Winning against a stranger is easy. Winning against your own father leaves a different kind of silence. The HOA eventually cancelled the fines against me and returned the money I had paid. The board also removed Dad from his position after its review found repeated misuse of enforcement procedures, but the money wasn't what mattered. What mattered was standing in my own driveway one evening and realizing I no longer felt watched. The mailbox was just a mailbox. The fence was just a fence. My house was simply my home again. And maybe that's why this story matters. People often think revenge means making someone suffer. Sometimes it means refusing to let someone else's power define your worth. I hadn't destroyed my father. I had simply stopped allowing him to rewrite the truth. And once the truth was finally visible, he didn't need me to punish him. His own choices had already done that. Months later, the blue folder was still in my desk drawer. I rarely opened it. I didn't need to. The HOA replaced its leadership, rewrote its enforcement procedures, and required every future fine to be reviewed before being issued. The neighbors became more comfortable speaking up, especially when something didn't feel right. As for Dad, we eventually spoke. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no perfect apology, and no sudden return to the father I remembered as a child. We sat across from each other at a small diner, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of plates and quiet conversations. He looked older. I probably did too. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, he said. I knew that wasn't the whole truth, but I also knew I didn't want to spend the rest of my life carrying anger. So I told him, you were protecting your position. There's a difference. He looked down at his coffee. Neither of us said much after that. Maybe some relationships aren't repaired by pretending nothing happened. Maybe they're repaired by finally admitting what did. I went home afterward and stood on my porch. The evening sun stretched across the lawn Dad had once fined me for. For the first time, I saw the house exactly as Grandpa had intended it to be. Not a battlefield, not an inheritance dispute, not a symbol of control, just home. I never needed another victory. I had learned something far more valuable. Silence isn't weakness when you're using it to gather the truth. Dad thought he owned the neighborhood because everyone listened when he spoke. But Lot 14 taught me something he never understood. You don't need to raise your voice when the truth already knows your address.